Today is August 31st, 2024. I'm Corinne Davenport. We're at the River Terrace Reunion Picnic, the 16th annual. Do I have permission to record this interview?
Yes, you do.
Marvelous. Can you introduce yourself?
My name is Deborah Grimstead. I grew up at 213 Anacostia Avenue Northeast, across from the river.
Lovely. So how long, you grew up here. Were you born and raised here?
Yes.
Marvelous. How long has your family been in River Terrace?
They bought in 1951. My father was in the Navy, and through the GI Bill, they were able to buy a home here.
Fantastic. So just tell me what it was like growing up here.
I didn't know growing up how perfect a neighborhood it was, because it's a cul-de-sac community in that there's basically one way in and one way out, so we don't have cars driving through on a race somewhere. And it was very safe, and because of the nature of segregation at that time, it seemed to me that all the residents had something to prove that they could have beautiful front yards, and they could have a neighborhood with virtually no crime. The early presidents of the River Terrace Community Organization included my father, so I was exposed to community activism early on.
So what kind of work did they do while you were growing up, the community organization?
My father was the president of the community organization. At one time, he was chairman of the beautification committee. They actually had a contest for who could have the most beautiful front yard throughout River Terrace. River Terrace has about 2,000 homes, so it was, it's not just 10 people. It was quite the competition. My parents, so the way my mother was was a secretary. My father worked for the post office. So their arrangement was he would come up with these ideas and she would type them up. She would send letters to the DC government, for example, to get the ramp from 295 into River Terrace. Because of his efforts that happened, and a lot of other things like that happened because they were just so active for so many years. And as it turned out, the men and women who were the leaders at the beginning, they just switched off roles. Okay, your turn to be president, I'll be secretary, or I'll be beautification committee or something like that.
Amazing.
It was quite a collaborative effort. And again, I said they had something to prove to the segregated world. And not that River Terrace was segregated. I'm an unofficial historian for River Terrace. And one of the stories my mother would tell me all the time is, they gave away their homes when we moved in. River Terrace was a large development because there's 2,000 homes, so it started in 39. But my parents didn't move into 51, and I believe it was in 48 that the housing desegregation law passed. So the white residents fled, and black residents were able to come in. But my parents were indeed original owners. No one else lived in their house before them.
We'll circle back to your work as a historian for the neighborhood. But I just want to know a little bit more about kind of growing up around here. Do you have any favorite memories growing up in the neighborhood?
I have.
What did you do?
I have not favorite memories, but in hindsight, it was a miracle that they even happened. There was a resident named Lavinia Miller who organized children into a group called the Lawn Rangers, named after the Lone Ranger TV show back in the day. And she had us digging up weeds, planting flowers, and she was instrumental in the work that was done to get the rose garden set up back in the day. So that was really precious. Turned out, I didn't know this at the time. I was not an outdoors person. We gotta go do that. And our parents actually went with us. They stood there and said, okay, dig deeper. But they were with us right behind us when we were doing all this work. And I did not want to be outdoors, but lo and behold, she was professionally an illustrator, a botany illustrator. How rare that is for a black person, let alone a black woman. And was, I learned later, much later, honored in her field, and just incredible that she even bothered with children at all when she could be going off doing professional things. So that's a great community effort that she led. And I'm glad she did, but at the time, fingers are dirty, everything, bugs bite me. Oh, didn't like it at all. Another great memory is the ice cream truck. Now, refrigerators back in the day had this much freezer space. So you weren't buying a gallon of ice cream and stuff like that. So the music would play, and we'd go running out to get some ice cream from the ice cream truck, and it was a nickel. And that was a great memory. It seemed to me that mostly young families moved into River Terrace when I was growing up. So I had children my age within 3 doors of me. So we played together. So I had playmates right next door, and I have an older sister, and there were some parents, young adults, young married couples that were older than my parents, so they had older children. So she had children to play with. So everything we needed was in River Terrace.
Amazing. And did you and your sisters, or sister, grow up with those friends? Like, did you go through all of school and everything?
No, because to my parents, it was a good thing. Education was the most important thing of all. And my sister was 8 years older than I am. When she went to Eastern High School, which River Terrace is zoned for, or was zoned for at the time, it was a great school. She turned out to be editor of the newspaper, the school newspaper, the senior year. And they were very pleased with that school. 8 years later, nah, you're not going to Eastern. So before there were magnet schools, there was a program in DC Public Schools for McKinley Technology High School to recruit students just for specific fields, architecture, engineering, biology, like what a doctor would aspire to. I'm thinking there were 5. So I went to McKinley in the architecture program, but I never actually pursued an architecture profession, but I did do 2 years of architecture school in college. So the answer to your question is no, because a lot of us spun off to different schools. Not everybody went to Eastern. There were people who put their kids at parochial school after they finished good old River Terrace Elementary School, and I'm looking over there because it's right over there. But I started out at River Terrace Elementary School, and in fact, after 3rd grade, there was some kind of program, some kind of DC Public School program. It wasn't an honors program. I don't know what they called it. But I got tested, and I ended up at Charles Young Elementary School. So there was a separation right there. Whereas maybe the people who stuck with their boundary schools the whole time had lifelong friendships, but I didn't. My lifelong friendships were the people who were plus or minus 3 to where I lived. And it just so happened that our neighbors plus or minus 3 were just extraordinary people. But I didn't know that at the time. It was just, yeah, I'll get off your grass. I won't jump your head just yet. But one of them had been in the Marines. Another one had been a Tuskegee Airman. Another one was a lawyer. Another one worked for the Department of Public Works, whatever they were calling them at the time. So these were, for that time period, Black men who were about something and improving their community, the neighborhood, and life for all colored people at the time. And they had, my mother would say, oh, well, your father was never home. But I appreciate that because he was out trying to get things to be better for me when I was out in the real world. He was just trying to improve things. So he was very active. And someone, okay, one of the reasons I'm the unofficial historian is because I got a grant from the NCCC to do a history thing. And someone who knew of the Grimsteads said, oh yeah, your parents were pillars of the community. Really? Oh, all right. But now that I've done the history and I've done the research, yes, indeed, they were. They were so active, they were pillars of the community.
So how much did you know about their community work then, and what have you learned since?
I didn't know anything about it then, except for they were not available. They didn't want too tired to play catch. They weren't at home. I didn't know anything. But it is passed down to me because where I live now, I'm a longtime member of the Development Task Force, which is a subsidiary of the Lamont Riggs Citizens Association. So I followed in my father's footsteps. He would be glad. He would be glad.
Yeah. Do you know how many people in this community were like former military while you were growing up?
I don't know, because my parents kept me on a short leash, which was a good thing. In hindsight, that was a good thing. I wasn't even allowed to cross the street. I said earlier, I grew up on Anacostia Avenue, across from the river. I was not allowed to cross the street without getting permission in advance. So I just knew plus or minus 3, really, for where I lived. I didn't go roaming all over the neighborhood. Now, when my sister was born, 8 years prior, my parents were new to living in a community like this, where you didn't grow up and your grandmother's around the corner, all that kind of thing. And I have been told stories that my father would go out in the front yard and yell for my sister to tell her to come home for dinner because they let her go anywhere.
It's always unfair how you siblings do.
Yes. And she could project her voice, and I've learned from my father how to project my voice. So she got to know all kinds of people. I was just plus or minus 3 right for it. Even once I got a bicycle and learned how to ride a bike, I wasn't going anywhere. And a lot of the amenities you see in River Terrace today, I didn't grow up with. There was no path, there was no trail. There was no gazebo. But it was still a beautiful little neighborhood, like a little piece of suburbia. And I didn't know where River Terrace was relative to the rest of D.C. And I just knew it was a long ride to get to McKinley.
Yeah, so how did you grow into the role of community historian, unofficial community historian?
The grant, and it's all just happenstance, circumstance. So Brooklyn community at the time would have a farmer's market. And I was there walking around, and I saw a sign, a handmade sign that said River Terrace. I'm like, why is there a River Terrace sign in Brooklyn? So I went over and investigated, and this gentleman, an artist, a sculptor, had received funding. He was commissioned to do some steel artwork for River Terrace. And in fact, the steel artwork was supposed to hang on the fence, hang on 33rd Street on the back side of the school. Medallions, they were called. And I said, well, you don't know anything about River Terrace. And I said it nicely. And we ended up collaborating because these medallions that he was designing, he had no background information. He had no context of what he was going to put on the medallions, what they were going to represent. So I informed him about the Tuskegee Airmen. So there was one that represented military. There was one that represented the founding of the River Terrace Community Organization. There was one that represented the Native Americans because they were here before colonialism and all that occurred. So they were living on the river, feeding themselves from the bounty from the river and so forth. So it was about 18 medallions. So in order to do all that research, I knew what my mother told me, but I had to do more research about the history of River Terrace and who lived there and how many were there and look at the census records and all that. It ended up, we did the medallions. I did a website called River Terrace Scrapbook. History Scrapbook that's available now with a lot of pictures from back in the day, in the 50s and the 60s. And and I ended up writing a history of River Terrace for Wikipedia. And it just so happened, here's another coinky dinky, it just so happened that the National Wikipedia Conference was in D.C. at that time. And I looked at it, but I didn't know how it worked. Oh, and professionally, I'm a technical writer, so writing doesn't bother me at all. And whoa, Wikipedia, okay, that's cool. And Wikipedia, as you probably know, is open source. You don't have to get permission. You don't have to spell anything correctly. You just post. Boom, it's there. And somebody had written a description of River Terrace and had the boundaries all wrong. It's just like, how could you get the boundaries wrong? The river, the highway, the bridge, Benning Road. How hard is that? But so I just wiped out what they had altogether and posted my own description of River Terrace history. So that's how I became, because no one had looked it up, and everyone just assumed, because it was such a tight-knit community from the get-go, everyone just assumed, oh yeah, well, wasn't that at the library in the elementary school? Didn't we give that to the DC Public Library? No, they don't. They got this much. They have nothing. So that's how it became the unofficial history. And it dawned on me, oh, wait a minute, let's do something at this reunion picnic. And so I started the history tent. I'm trying to think, what year was that? Probably 2015, 2016, I started the history tent. Got recruited people I didn't know to help me, and it was another great community effort. And even at the time had a pioneer tent, which I set up for the seniors, the then seniors, people who were initial owners of homes.
Amazing. So it's been almost a decade now since you did your first history tent. What all have you done with the history tent every year? What do you have there? What's your goal at the picnic with it?
Oh, lots of stuff. Someone within the plus or minus 3 passed away, and she had been keeping tons of River Terrace newsletters from the 50s, from the 60s, photos. So I got a whole lot of material from her. So I had those. I had photos that I got from her as well, and actually created photo albums with photos from when we were kids and we were playing. And so but you could look through. I would have them for display here at the reunion picnic, and they would go, oh yeah, well that's Brian, that's Ernest, that's the name people that they saw in the photo. So that was a draw to the history tents. I was trying to share what a great history River Terrace had that even the people that grew up here may not have known. River Terrace has a legacy of generations that were here. I do know personally of one on Dick Street, but that didn't happen in my family, but there are generations that have lived here. So we're very proud of their little River Terrace.
Amazing. And what between your research and your time at the history, like your work at the history tent and everything else, what surprised you that you learned? What did you already know? What did you have no idea about, even if it was next door?
I didn't understand that this park we're in now that has a few trees was a forest. When my parents moved in, all of this was wooded, like a jungle, a total forest. And that to me is just inconceivable that this was a forest. But I have pictures that prove it. It was a forest. Yeah, that was the biggest thing. And now that I've been this amateur community historian, I've gone to some DC history conferences and stuff, I understand a lot more about how DC on the whole came to be. And yes, the more affluent people always lived in the Northwest because that's where the freshest water came from. Downriver, you had people dumping all kinds of things in the river. So that's always been an affluent area of Washington, D.C., back to colonial times. And the road layout, and my father being a post office employee, back before they had zip codes, post employees had to know where every street was. They had zones, and they sorted the mail by looking at the address and going, okay, I know Minnesota Avenue's in that zone. So he was real big on talking about the roads all the time. And you understand it's 4 sections, four northeast, south, and this is the crossing point, and there's an avenue for each capital, and there's 2-syllable street names and 3-syllable street names, and I don't think even people who lived here for ages know that kind of stuff. You can get a sense of what part of the diamond you're in based on how many syllables are in the name of the street. But so I had a lot of exposure to where DC came from and bought books and read up, and I knew George Washington slept here, slept everywhere, but I didn't know that Lincoln had a cottage out by the Armed Forces Retirement Home. But I know that now. I've been there.
So what sorts of changes have you noticed over the decades in the neighborhood? You were talking about the park development. Are there any other kind of big changes that have happened in River Terrace?
Speed bumps. Speed bumps on Anacostia Avenue. Because people were using this as a racetrack because it's one of the few just complete stretches of road that's not filled with schools and stores and things. Speed bumps, yes. And the school got turned into a school specializing in special needs. But the houses all look the same. Look. They're still red brick houses. Look the same.
Yeah, so what was it like going, you said you went to elementary school in the neighborhood for some of it? What was it like there? How long had it been open by then?
Not that long, because it was built as a white school. So not that long. And I have in I believe I mentioned in the Wikipedia article that the white residents didn't want black students going to that school. But once the desegregation law passed in 48, game over. And they continued to move out. I remember one teacher who was dear to my heart. I just killed the microphone, I'm sorry. Dear to my heart, Mrs. Cadenhead, my third grade teacher, and turns out the last teacher I had at River Terrace. But it was great, and because it's right here in the community, you walk home with a classmate. It was totally pleasant, and I hear stories about, over my lifetime, I've met people who had to ride the bus to school, and they had to go through that whole desegregation thing with riding the bus to school. And riding the bus to school is just never, riding a bus that picks you up, a yellow school bus, was just not in my wheelhouse. Like, what? No, I ride the city bus. And they get mad when I had my violin, taking my violin home to practice. And I would scratch up the pantyhose of the women sitting on the seats in the front that are facing the inside of us. I'm sorry, but I've been told to bring this thing home to practice. Violin didn't have a future with me either, but it was good exposure.
And then how much has your work kind of looked into the history of the environmental activism on the Anacostia River around here?
In the course of doing all that research, found out a lot about it. Hooked up with the Anacostia Watershed Society. Finally got to ride in a boat on the river past my house. But not because I could see my house, because there's a huge drop-off on the bank, and the further you go, there's a huge drop-off. So I had to recognize where my house is located by the tree, by a humongous tree that's in front of where I grew up that interfered with the badminton games of me and my girlfriend because the branches were too low. Now that wouldn't be a problem. But that, and there's a famous River Terracer called George Gurley. And he was at the forefront of black environmentalism. The Pepco power plant is on the other side of Benner Road, and we had problems with that for a long time, with pollution. They were burning coal there at one point. So I personally didn't have a role in environmental activism, but I know people who did. And they even, it was so bad, the pollution, that they got the government to do a study. And the study revealed that, yes, the asthma rates in this community are high, but we can't prove that the asthma was caused by the pollution coming from that power plant. So, which is now they torn down the plant, and it's a Superfund site.
Following since that demolition and everything, have you been following any of the news about how it's going to be developed? How is that development up there finally? Yeah. Now that it's finally been torn down, some treatment is maybe happening soon. How have you been following that?
Just on TV news and the newspaper, and I know a few people who still live here. Not super closely. As you can see behind me, the stadium is there, and now DC has finally decided, oh, we want to keep the stadium in DC. Some have put forth that, well, just put it over there. Put it where the power plant used to be. Clean it up as a Superfund site, then put it over there, and people can take the metro. You can put in a metro stop there, an inline stop, and people can take the metro to the games. So I don't know if that'll come to fruition. One of the things I came to accept when I was doing all the River Terrace history research was that River Terrace, my parents and their peers were about not letting anything come in and spoil River Terrace. No, you cannot put an amusement park on Kingman Island, the landmass on the other side of the Anacostia River. They did a fantastic job of keeping things out and keeping River Terrace the lovely cul-de-sac community it is. I wanted to, in the history I was doing, have something magnanimous to say about what River Terrace was doing, but there was no, look at this, they're responsible for this. No, they kept everything out. There's nothing to show for it, but they kept everything out because they worked so hard to keep this a wonderful neighborhood.
So you were talking about efforts like previously to keep kind of certain developments out of the neighborhood to like help maintain the neighborhood vibe. How do you see that kind of continuing today, especially as DC continues to go through some really wild development and gentrification, like everywhere?
I hope it doesn't happen to River Terrace. Okay, so my parents were original owners, but there are people they lived here for 60 years. But there are people who lived here for 20 years and 30 years. So I hope they stop that kind of thing from happening. There's a term in urban design in DC called planned unit development. This was a planned unit development. They didn't call it that in 1939, but it was planned. They have all these residences, and then out on Benning Road, you have a little shopping center, you have a little grocery store, you have a little barber shop. So all these things were in place. I hope the homes continue to stand tall.
Have you noticed any of those kind of gentrification style changes happening here yet?
Just a few, but not on Anacostia Avenue, not on my street. Yep. But there have been some additions put on further back toward the highway. There have been some additions put on, but I haven't seen houses totally, like a group of three totally torn down and something from mid-century modern built in its place. I haven't seen that.
All right. And what do you hope to see in the future of the neighborhood as you continue to help document its history, but also as it moves forward?
I was told today that the newest developments on the perimeter of River Terrace have gone bankrupt or insolvent. There was going to be a food hall on Benning Road, and that's gone insolvent. They've almost finished building some senior housing, and that's not predicted to do well. The commercial corridor was always on Benning Road. It never reached into the streets where the residences are. The Chateau, I am told, has closed, has stopped operating. The Chateau is a dance hall that back in the beginning was the Jumbo grocery store. And it's famous in its own right for being on the periphery of River Terrace for decades. But no, it's closed. And the pandemic didn't help a dance hall stay open, so I get it. They saved the school. Thank goodness they saved the school, because there was talk about, oh, let's raise the school and build condos on the waterfront. One of the good things is this is Park Service land that we're sitting on, and the Park Service doesn't give up land. So this will still be here.
Are there any kind of park developments that you hope to see too? You said it used to be a forest, and now there's pathways, and there can be some access points to the water and stuff. Are there things you want to see in the park, like community spaces?
I'm okay with with a little dock, not a marina, but a little dock access to the park, from the river to the park, and it's we see Maryland license plates here, so people do come from far and wide, and it's the trail network in DC is growing all the time. So this trail that was not here when I was growing up, but now here it connects to other parts, which connect to other parts. So we see bikers on that quite a bit.
And are there any places that you used to always go that you go now a lot that you want to just shout out as some of your favorite places in the neighborhood?
No, because they've all gone. I mean, I loved River Terrace Elementary School, and they did keep the back part, the part on 33rd, kind of looking the same. So yeah, I can still spot where my third grade classroom used to be. I can still spot where I used to use the playground equipment there. No, because it's residences, and I wasn't allowed to cross the street, so I was limited to playing badminton with my girlfriend 2 doors over on Anacostia Avenue on the other side of the street, not out in this grass open space. And there was flat part. It wasn't like it immediately dropped off a cliff into the river, but no, I was playing right there in front of my house, from my parents' house.
Amazing. And just about the reunion picnic, how long have you been just involved in any way, even before the history tent, or it started with the history tent?
No, it didn't start with the history tent. They started before the history tent started. I don't know now. I don't remember how I found out about it. Oh, but wait a minute. But there must have been a notice put in the doors when it first started to get everybody to turn out. Because I was saying before that I had the pioneer tent. So my mother was still living, and my best friend's mother was still living, and I would have them in the pioneer tent. So that must be how I first found out about it. And it was my mother died in 2014, and so it was after that I got the grant and started dig, which is a shame. I had all that history right there in front of me. She died at the age of 94, but I think I did right by my parents in terms of getting the history of River Terrace publicized.
And do you have any specific memories or anything you want to say about the picnic since you've been coming since it started?
It's amazing the people that know who I am, but I don't know who they are. A lot of people, because I've been to the picnic years before, and I'm walking around, and somebody passes me and says my name, and I go, I didn't. No, and I wouldn't remember my classmates. And back then, I mean, photography had been invented, but they weren't taking class pictures like you do at every grade now. So I didn't have any people from my class. And the great thing about over time is that the people that whose names I do remember, that I wasn't best friends with or anything, but they've come to me and said, "Hi, I'm Paulette." Paulette? Oh my God! Haven't seen you in 15 years, 20 years. So that the reunion aspect is well and alive, and there's no telling who's coming, so you got to walk around or make some noise or be in a history tent. And no one in River Terrace knew that anybody was collecting all this stuff, and we've, in order to get the medallions done, the sculptor set up a scanning machine. So we've had picnics where we've asked people to, ahead of time, bring all your old stuff, and we'll scan it in. So it's been very nice to see people that remember my name, but I've forgotten their names.
And what do you hope for the future of your project? What do you want to do next? Where do you want everything? Do you want everything housed? What do you hope to collect?
I want someone else to pay for the annual fee to have the River Terrace History Scrapbook website exist. It was programmed by an individual who got paid through the grant that I got. I now know that there are lots of tools to help individuals collate that kind of information. So I think it needs to be updated. And that even once the project, my grant project was finished, I was getting stuff, getting more photos, taking more things in. So I'd like to see the 2.0 version of the River Terrace History Scrapbook become available somehow, somewhere.
Amazing. Well, is there anything else you want to add about yourself, the neighborhood, the project, the million things that we've been able to talk about today?
No, not that I could think of.
Alrighty. Well, thank you very much.
You're welcome.